Welcome to Who's in the Room, supporting LGBTQ plus community conversations on sexuality and gender, provided by the PACP Partnership in association with the Office of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services. At any time during the presentation, please type your questions into the Q&A feature, which you will find by running your mouse along the bottom of the Zoom screen. It's right there next to the chat feature. Today's moderators are Kelsey Leonard, our Cultural and Linguistic Competency Coordinator, Nancy Massey, who is our Social Marketing Coordinator, Mark Durgan, who is the Project Director for the PACP Partnership, and myself, Jamal Ford, who is the Youth Resources Coordinator. That said, I will turn it over to Nancy to introduce our presenter today.
Welcome, everyone. Today, in honor of June, is Pride Month, and specifically in remembrance of the Stonewall riots, which occurred 51 years ago today. It is our honor to welcome today's presenter, Dr. Yolanda Turner, an associate professor and co-chair of the psychology department at Eastern University, where she is also the faculty advisor for Refuge, the student LGBTQA support group on campus. Dr. Turner received her MA in therapy from Hahnemann Medical University and her PhD in human sexuality from Widener University. Dr. Turner.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate you inviting me to do this. It's going to be a fun hour and a half. Let me share my screen and we can get started. All right, here we go. Y'all see that? Just double checking. All right, so today's topic is going to expand over a huge range of concepts and definitions and terms. It's going to be a lot. We're going to go through it quickly, but we will also have some handouts and things that Nancy can send out to y'all at the end to kind of review and remember as we go. And do please put in your questions if you have any. We'll stop periodically throughout the presentation and give y'all an opportunity to ask questions through Kelsey. But before I start, I want to thank you all for being here. I know time is a rare commodity for all of us. And so for you to spend this time with me, I really appreciate it. I also want to thank some folks from my colleagues, my friends who have contributed over the years to this presentation. These folks are my support and have given me so much in the gift of information, and the things that I'm going to be sharing with you today are really based in the work that these folks have done. So I wanted to acknowledge that before we started. So let's just jump in here. That's a lot of letters, and some people just go, too much, I don't care anymore. But it's important that we know what all these letters mean. First of all, we need to use accurate language. If I'm talking to somebody about an LGBTQ concept, issue, theory, whatever, I want to make sure that what I'm using, the language that I'm using, is accurate, and that other people understand that I know what I'm talking about. And so often I'll be having conversations with people where we're using the same language, but we have very different definitions. And very often I think, I don't think that means what you think it means. So it's really important that the more we can understand all of these terms, the better we'll be able to communicate. And it really helps us to assist our patients, our clients, our friends, and our family, because here's the bottom line. It's really important for us to understand what specific terms mean, because no matter where we stand on the social perspective, political, theological, whatever, it's important that folks who identify with the things we're going to be talking about today don't feel the need to constantly educate other people about who they are, what they mean, what they do. So doing our work is really important around understanding what all these terms are. And I find too that it's not just straight folks who need to understand this stuff. All the folks who fall into these categories have grown up in the same way the rest of us have, and we don't have a lot of information about this. So very often we assume that people who identify in one of these LGBTQ categories knows all about all the other ones, and that's just not true. So it's really important that we know what these terms mean and use accurate language. So I'm using, for the basis of this, a model, the SIEO model. Eli Green and Luca Mar have produced this, and it's going to be in the handout that Nancy will send to you. But the basis of this is that everyone has a sex, has a gender identity, has a gender expression, and a sexual orientation. And there's lots of things that fall under each of those categories. So we're going to be talking about each one. We're going to talk about them each separately, and we're going to define and understand how they're distinct concepts. But then we're going to look at the end of all this, how do they connect? How are they related to each other? And once we know what each of those things are, we can then be able to talk about how they connect. So let's just start with the difference between sex and gender. People confuse these all the time. For example, a gender reveal party is absolutely not a gender reveal party. It's a sex reveal party. So let's talk about what the difference is between this. When we talk about the word sex, we're talking biology. So a person's sex refers to their biology, their anatomy, chromosomes, hormones, etc. Sex is about biology, and it has to do with those markers, right, that we put on our driver's license and birth certificate, male or female. Typically, those are our two choices, and we'll talk about the problem with that in a second. So we are taught basically in middle school what needs to occur for typical sexual development. And we're going to go through all of these things. This is what has to happen for someone to be assigned male or female from conception on. We're going to go through these a little quickly, and we'll talk then about what that influences. So we've all learned this in middle school, right? The whole development of chromosomal sex, X and Y. If the initial chromosomal combination is XX, the trajectory for a girl begins. And if it's XY, the trajectory for boy starts. The next stage of development is gonadal sex. In other words, the sex organs, right? The ovaries and testicles. If the message of the chromosomes is XY, XX, then this tissue in this little fetus will become and develop ovaries. If the message is XY, that same tissue becomes the testes. So same thing, different message, becomes a different body part. Then the next stage is hormonal sex. So if the message is XX and if ovaries develop, then more estrogen is pumped into the system. If the message is XY and if testes develop, then more androgen, testosterone, is pushed into the system. So we all have estrogen and androgen, but it's just a matter of degree, right? So some of us get more estrogen and some more androgen. The next stage is the development of internal genitalia. And this is where it gets kind of more interesting, at least for me. If the chromosomal message is XX, and if ovaries develop, and if enough estrogen is pumped into the system, then the Müllerian structures, right, this tissue in the body, becomes fallopian tubes, the uterus, the upper vagina, etc. That is the basic trajectory of human development. If, however, the message is XY, and if testes develop, and enough androgen is pushed into the system, then the Müllerian structures need to be turned off and the Wolffian structures turned on. In other words, the trajectory, the drive to be female has to be stopped, and then the male development can begin. So those same tissue that becomes uterus, fallopian tubes, etc., if given the right information, becomes the vas deferens, the prostate, seminal vesicles, etc. Same material, different message. This is something that has some controversy. We're not really sure if there is a difference between male and female brains or what that difference actually is. Some research is looking at kind of like a wash that happens during the second trimester. Some people are looking into whether that also may occur around puberty, but we don't have a lot of really clear information right now about the difference in brain development. So here's the last biological shift that occurs. So let me walk you through this. If the message is XX in the chromosome, and if ovaries develop, and if enough estrogen is pushed into the system, and if the Müllerian structures continue, then the external genitalia becomes clitoris, labia, etc. If the message is XY, and if testes develop, and if enough estrogen is in the system, and if the Müllerian structures are shut down and the Wolffian structures turned on, that same material becomes the penis. It's all the same material, getting different messages and becoming different organs. This is really, for me, the miracle of birth. For all of that to happen, click, 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 like clockwork, that often does, is pretty amazing. But you'll notice that I've been saying, if this happens, and if this happens, not when, because that doesn't always happen that way. Nature has some inconsistencies. So for example, there are chromosomal abnormalities that can occur. These are just some of them on the screen right now, right? XO, so, and some of these combinations have different names like Turner syndrome, that the message right from the get-go is not a clear XX or XY. And the hormonal abnormalities that can occur are vast. This is just some of them, where the hormonal messages that get sent into the system are either not clear, they're not absorbed, etc. So we could go through every single one of those gates that I had just mentioned and look at where sometimes the typical development doesn't occur, and there's some inconsistencies and some difference. And when that happens, when the typical trajectory does not happen, the folks who have differences in any of those stages are intersex. So the term intersex, that's the I in LGBTQI, right? This is a term for the variety of ways that people can be born where their reproductive or sexual anatomy is not the typical trajectory. So people can have mixed genitalia, internalized genitalia, ambiguous genitalia, etc. So this on the bottom of this slide here, that is where when a child is born, it's the external genitalia that people typically look at to say, yes, you had a boy or a girl. Very often, however, people will have a new baby and you cannot say definitively, that's a boy or that's a girl. And that makes people really anxious when that happens. There's lots of changes that occur. And what typically happens is that little babies are surgically altered so that their genitals look more like a typical male or typical female body. There is usually, most often, no medical reason for surgery to occur. Very often, little babies will be surgically treated and never told that that has happened to them. So they'll go through multiple operations and never be told that that is what happened to them as a baby. They might feel something was different or know something was not what they should be feeling, but they're not told that this happens. And the only reason, people aren't trying to be mean. It's not that people are like, we have to pick one. It's that it's easier to walk through life knowing that you have that label, male or female. Parents want to be able to say to their friends, we had a boy or a girl. And as we talk more this afternoon, we'll look at how focused on male and female and that binary the world is. So it's just easier, right? And people want it. They just want a normal life. Right? So this intersex situation doesn't always show up at birth. Sometimes it reaches, like when a child is entering into puberty and they're not going through the regular pubescent changes, developing secondary sex characteristics, etc. They may get some medical treatment and find out that they are intersex, that it did not show externally when they were born. Sometimes when couples are trying to have a child and they're not able to get pregnant, they might go and do some testing and find out that one of them is intersex. So this shows up at various points throughout people's lives. This is the question I get most often. It's like, how often does this occur? And it occurs a lot. About 1 in 1,500 to 1 in 2,000 births, and that's for noticeably atypical genitalia. That is not counting the subtler forms of variations that might show up later in life. That is about the same ratio as being redheaded. It's about the same ratio as being left-handed. That's a lot of folks. We're not taught this, right? This is not common information when we learn in middle school about sexual development. And there's a lot of folks who fall into this intersex category. Let me just stop there for a second. Kels, do we have questions at this point?
So I'm not seeing any questions in our Q&A. Folks are welcome to add a question into the Q&A if you have a question at this stage. You just look, sometimes folks put things into the chat box, so we'll take a look over there.
We'll have other opportunities too for questions. So if
so I think we can keep moving forward.
Okay, because anytime you have a question, even if it's something from now in the beginning of the presentation, you're welcome to ask it later as well. All right.
And just so that you're aware, you do have the option to put questions in anonymously.
Right.
Oh, wonderful. And we got a lot of questions that came in. So I think folks were actually just trying to navigate the Q&A feature.
Right.
Do you take one now and then we can save some more for later?
Sounds good.
Okay, so the first question that we have is, where is the medical association with, I guess, doing any type of surgical relation to babies? So I think there's a question around if there's an intersex association, what types of advocacy happens as to whether or not, I guess, parents should be making that determination at that age of birth.
Yes. So the North American Intersex Association is a huge community of folks doing a lot of work around medical intervention, legal issues, etc. And they are working diligently, and they may have changed their name lately, to educate physicians, OBGYN folks, to wait, to not do anything and wait until this little child can figure out who they are and what they're about, since there is no medical emergency. And then there's also a need for some assistance for parents and families to help navigate how to raise a intersex child when the majority of folks that they're going to be in contact with don't know about it or understand it. but very, very little training do medical professionals get around any of these issues.
Thank you for that answer. And there's a few other intersex related questions that I wonder if we might also explore because they seem to align.
Sure.
So there's a question around, were there sort of passé terms or old terms for intersex that we no longer use?
Yes, we used to use the word hermaphrodite. And that is a very outdated term. It's also something that only refers to mixed genitalia and not any of the other kinds of intersex issues. So that's a term we don't use anymore.
And along those lines, this is another really great question. We have sort of the maybe potential medical terminology of intersex, or that new term. Is that something that intersex folks actually call themselves, or is there other terminology that's emerging?
I'm sure there's other terms that are emerging. There's always new terms emerging, but typically intersex is the common term. And if someone else knows of another term, please feel free to post it. That'd be great.
Yeah, feel free to add those into the chat box. So there are two questions that I think are related, and I'll combine. One is around what other types of future or existing research there are connecting sort of trauma-informed care related to intersex surgery at that age, or if there's different studies at sort of what age it occurs.
Yes,
we'll start there.
Yeah, I am not familiar with all of the work that's going on in the intersex community around trauma-informed care. But that's a wonderful question. I'm not really sure what the most current research is right now and what's happening.
Sounds like another opportunity for future training.
There you go.
Well, the last question before we move on around this space is, there was just a clarity question around if there are examples of non-typical genitalia in intersex individuals. I guess maybe I think that individual is maybe trying to better understand the differences between what might have been the normative classification under that passé term of hermaphrodite versus the more inclusive terminology we now see with intersex.
So Kelsey, I'm not sure if I understand the question. What are some of the ways that it appears? Is that?
I think that might be it. So the language used, and whoever put this question in, if you have a clarifying statement, feel free to add that into the Q&A, but it's examples of non-typical genitalia. So I guess maybe they're actually asking about what are the physical representations that would classify it as non-typical.
Sometimes, so when a child is born, there's actually something called a penile meter. It's like a little tiny ruler that people use to measure the penis or clitoris if the clitoris appears too big or the penis appears too small, micropenis. That folks get really upset about that, and they have this ruler that kind of determines whether something may or may not be wrong and might indicate that further study be done on this child. There's also some visual pieces, right? So that you might have a vagina with testes that, and usually they're not fully dropped, right? But there's testes in the labia, all kinds of different things like that.
Wonderful. And they did get back to us and say that that was the exact type of question they were referencing. So thank you so much to Dr. Turner, and we will turn it back to you. And I know a few folks still have questions. We'll get to them, but in the next series.
Great. All right. So we just began talking about intersexuality, right? Sex having to do with biology. So the term intersex is a completely different term from transgender, completely different things. So let's talk about what the difference is between intersex and transgender. Sex, yes, anatomy and chromosomes. Gender is the way that people identify in their head and their heart. So their psychology, right? How they know themselves to be on this continuum from man to woman. And so a person's gender identity does not have to do with their sex or their body. It has to do with their internal sense of knowing who they are as a gendered being, their own expression of and perception of who they are. And it is not based in somebody's body, right? For example, I have a friend who had a double mastectomy and a hysterectomy. she still knows she's a woman, even though all her female body parts are no longer part of her body. She still knows she's a woman, right? So gender identity has to do with knowing who we are as a man or a woman. And I cannot go through, this is how gender develops, because we have no idea. We don't know the stages of gender identity. We know that it has to do with all of these things, but we don't know what it is that contributes to someone's understanding of what their gender is, right? So when we talk about gender identity, the first term we want to pay attention to is called cisgender. I'm sure many of you have heard about cisgender identity. So a cisgender identity, gender identity, is when your sex of assignment, the sex that you were assigned at birth, right? Oh, you had a boy, oh, you had a girl. That sex of assignment matches who this person knows themselves to be. So if I was assigned female at birth and I know that I am girl or woman, then I am a cisgender woman. Okay? If my sex of assignment matches who I know myself to be, then I would be identified as a cisgender person. So when we talk about transgender, we're talking about a big umbrella term. It covers lots and lots of identities and ways that people label themselves or know themselves to be. But it really is a transgender identity is any identity that's not cisgender. That's the umbrella, right? So cisgender, my sex and my who I know myself to be match. Transgender, not that, right? And there's lots that fall under this umbrella. So first of all, it's not transgendered, right? We're not maled or femaled. You are transgender, right? So transgender refers to a person whose gender identity, who they know themselves to be, is not congruent with the sex they were assigned at birth. And some people will identify as man or woman, and some identify as neither of those binary terms, but as something else. And we'll talk about what some of those are, right? So this umbrella term of transgender has to do with who you know yourself to be. There's other terms, this is just a few of them, that people use for folks who identify as trans: gender nonconforming, gender queer, gender neutral, bigender, non-binary, two-spirit. So other terms that people use that mean not cisgender. So when we use the term transgender, these identities or these labels, what people call themselves, fall under that umbrella. This is a really hard concept for a lot of people to get. So let me do something with you if you choose to in the privacy of your own space there. Just pick up a pen or a pencil and write your name. Or if you don't have one handy, just close your eyes and imagine yourself picking up a pen or pencil and writing your name. Just do it in the air if you need to. And once you've done that, put that pencil in the other hand and write your name. If you are like most folks, you could pick up that utensil with the other hand and write your name. But it took a lot of intention and a lot of focus. Like you could do it, but it doesn't look like your signature, correct? Right? Like, here's my name. And then my other hand, it's hard. You can get something on the paper. And typically when I ask people, how did you know what hand to use when I initially said, pick up your pen? It's that just, I've always done it though. It just felt natural. It felt right. And what does it feel like with the other hand? It feels awkward and weird and uncomfortable. Right? We do not know why some people are right-handed and some people are left-handed, but we do know that people know if they're right-handed or left-handed, right? You just know. There are things about us as human beings that we know that makes sense, that we don't know why. Here's another thing to do. Just take your hands and fold them. Just fold your hands and then look down. Which thumb is on top? For some of you, it's your right thumb. For some of you, it's your left thumb. Now, try to do it the other way. Flip them. Ew. It just feels weird. And what if every time you folded your hands, you had to think about, oops, other way, do it the other, okay, got it. Set, cross your arms, just cross your arms, right? What arm's on top? For some people, it's their left, and for some people, it's their right. Try to do that the other way. It's like, yeah, right? It's like, I really have to think about that, and it feels weird. We could do all kinds of things like this, right? Lots and lots of things about us as human beings that we just do naturally, and we know that feels right for us. We don't know why. I don't know why some people put their thumb on top and the other thumb on top. Who knows? Right? That's about as close as you can come to kind of understanding this knowing piece about gender, right? I just know. This feels right. This doesn't. I can do it, but it feels wrong. Right? It just doesn't feel like I'm supposed to be doing that. Right? All right. So when you are, even before you're born, this gender socialization begins to occur. The world informs us constantly about what we are supposed to be like and how we're supposed to think and feel if we are one gender or one sex or the other. Right? So your sex of assignment, what people have assigned to you, will then kick off the socialization feedback that we get from the world. I had a teaching assistant once, and I just said, go out and buy some cards that are, yay, you had a baby card. You know, those cards like, yay, your new baby's here. And buy a couple for boys and a couple for girls. And they just randomly picked some up and brought them. And the girl cards all were, you know, of course, pastel pink, etc. But they had little characters on them. And the characters were always looking over their shoulder or looking up or right behind something, peeking away. And inside, they would say things like, your sweet little girl is here. Let the snuggles and cuddles begin. Okay? The boy cards, pastel, blue and, you know, yellow. The boy characters were full face on. Here I am looking right out into the world. And inside, the cards would say things like, let the adventure start. Let the games begin. It was all about like, wow, you're going to be running your head off with this little boy. Like, totally different from the sweet little girl. And everything is gendered that way. There is a website, I think it's called the Gender Mashup. It's an ad application where you have little boys commercials for toys on one side and little girls toys commercials on the other. And you can drag the sound from one and the visual from the other and play them together. And it's really disturbing because you'll have these little girls sitting in the visual playing with these tiny little toys, like little Polly Pockets. And if you put the boy toy audio on it, it's, and they go up the street and all the sound is really, and then if you do it opposite, and you have these little boys sitting there and they're playing with their trucks and they're going up the hills and they're doing their fights, and the sound is, and you can put their little clothes on and you can have them and the sound is all very like this. It's fascinating. And it feels so disruptive because when you see them together, you're aware of the fact that they're not fitting. So lots of socialization from the time we hold little babies. We have little boys, we bounce them up and down, we flip them out, we flip them in, we pat them on the back. Little girls, we rock side to side, we rub their back, we go like this. Right? Just the messaging. We could go on and on about this socialization, right? And when you're a child and you get to middle school, when you get to nursery school, right? The teacher doesn't say good morning, brown-eyed boys and girls. They don't say good morning, brown-eyed and blue-eyed children. They say good morning, boys and girls. The world is gendered, right? Boys and girls. And so this messaging, right, is coming to us all. And if you are someone who is cisgender, you're like, yep, cool, let's do it. If you are someone who is trans or not cisgender in some way, you're like, this messaging isn't fitting. This, I should be over there. This is not working for me. Sometimes that happens when kids are really little, like 3, 5. Sometimes it doesn't happen till puberty. Sometimes it doesn't happen till later in life where people are just like, this is not fitting for me. They just know, right? So we know that transgender identity is being transgender is not a choice. However, we don't know what causes that to occur, right? And we don't really know how many people are transgender. We have some estimates, you can see here on the slide, but this is probably really low estimates because the stigma around identifying as transgender is pretty intense. And so lots of folks may not identify that way or reveal that they feel or identify that way. But there is lots of indication that many, many, many folks fall somewhere on the transgender continuum. Gender dysphoria is the medical term, right? It's a formal diagnosis from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that says that a person meets the criteria to medically transition. We'll talk about that in 1 second. In other words, it's a medical diagnosis for being transgender. And so there's lots of controversy around that being in this diagnostic manual because it implies that it's a mental illness, because all of the other things in that manual are mental illnesses. However, in many parts of the country, in order to have any kind of medical assistance, you need to have a diagnosis. And in some places, insurance will cover some of the medical transitioning if there is a diagnosis. Many, many places in the United States, however, do not cover any kind of transition. So let's talk about that in a minute. We were talking about older terms for intersex. This is an older term for transgender, transsexual. We don't use that term anymore. We used to because it was a very binary term. I have the sex of assignment of female and I know myself to be a man, or vice versa. Transsexual is a term, however, that we don't use anymore. Now we use the term trans man or trans woman, and people get confused about these terms. So the way to remember which one to use is that you always end, right, the man or the woman, you always end with how the person walks through the world, how they identify. So if I had, follow me here, the sex of assignment of female at birth, but I know myself to be a man, and I walk through the world and identify as a man, and I am trans man. If my sex of assignment was male, but I know myself not to be male, I'm a woman, then I'm trans woman. Okay, so you always end with the way the person identifies, not with their sex of assignment. So now we use trans man, trans woman. So I talked a little bit about transitioning, and there's a couple different aspects of transition. The first one being what we call social transition, socially transitioning. And that is creating a life that is, right, presents my external expression of who I know myself to be, right? So when I come out, right, as non-cisgender, first of all, I have to figure out in my own heart, what is this, right? Because very often, if you don't have language for this, if you don't know this term, thank goodness for the internet, lots and lots of folks now can, like, I feel this way, and they can get some information. Prior to the internet, I have friends who didn't even hear the term transgender until they were in college. And it was like, oh my gosh, that's what I'm feeling. That's what's going on, right? If you don't have language for this, right? So once you begin to identify who you are and what's been going on, you come out to yourself and then begin to express that to other people, right? So socially transitioning is where your gender expression, right, what you show to the world, where that meets who you know yourself to be, right? So how a person chooses to outwardly express or present themselves, right? Jewelry, hair, how they move, the clothes they wear, all of that expression, right, gets read. We read gender expression all the time. Our brains are structured to categorize things. Right? So we immediately categorize male, female. I know how to respond to you. I know how to respond to you, because we're constantly categorizing. So the way that we do that is by reading people's gender expression. So people can express a really masculine or feminine gender expression, right? So looking more of one binary than the other. And then androgynous. If you look in the middle, that's Katie Lang. I'm sure many of you know who that is. But Katie Lang is very androgynous, right? If you look at her and you think male, you see more male, right? If you look at her and think female, you see more female. She's androgynous. It's not binary, right? In your brain, you're not like, I know how to respond to this person, right? As opposed to someone whose gender expression is really typical, stereotypical, or clear. Right? So your gender expression says to the world, this is how I perceive myself to be. Now, let's go back here for a second. It's dangerous to socially transition. It's more dangerous for a trans woman than it is for a trans man to socially transition, because of the way our society is set up, our world is set up. It makes sense to people that someone would want to be more like a man. Right? Men have the power, they have the privilege, they just do. And so it makes sense somewhere in our brains that categorize things, that people would want to be more masculine. That's why women have a much broader range of gender expression. If I wear a tux to a prom, people will think I'm cute, right? Because I have more of a range of gender expression. Right? It's more dangerous for a trans woman, because if my sex of assignment is male, why in the world, says the culture, would you want to be more feminine? Why would you want to give up that power and privilege and all the things that you have? Why do you want to be less than? Right? And so men's gender expression is much more narrow. Their ability to express the range of who they are is much more constricted. So for example, if my son wears a gown to prom, that's not going to be seen as cute. And because people do not understand what transgender identity is, it's dangerous to begin to mess with people's understanding of how they see you because it makes them uncomfortable. And when people are uncomfortable, they get mad. Okay? So if I cannot read you and I don't know what your gender expression is clearly telling me, or if your gender expression is different than what I know your sex of assignment to be, I'm going to be uncomfortable because I don't understand it and I don't know how to react. I don't know how to react to you. I know how to react to men and to women. I don't know how to react right now. And so I get upset and I want you to stop it. So stop it. Right? And some people will go out of their way to bully and harm and kill people who make them uncomfortable, and they want them to stop it. Right? So even things like, you're traveling in a car and your taillight's out, for someone who's a cisgender person, you get stopped, they look at your license, on your way you go. If you are trans and your license does not say what you present yourself to be, all of a sudden it's a great big deal. And it's not just a taillight. So this first stage of transitioning takes a lot. It takes a lot of thought and a lot of courage and hopefully a lot of support, but many, many people do not get that. So that's social transitioning. Medical transitioning is something some people will choose to do. There is no the surgery. Have you had the surgery? I hear people say that all the time. There is no the surgery. There's many different types of medical interventions that you can do to change your body to feel more congruent with who you know yourself to be. Okay? So hormonal changes in estrogen and testosterone, if you take more or less of one or the other, you are going to develop secondary sex characteristics of the hormone that you are increasing or blocking. Right? Some people have facial feminization surgery, where the face has, you decrease the width of the forehead and the jawline and change the facial structure to look more feminine. Some people have top surgery, they have double mastectomy. Some people have bottom surgery to change their genitalia, but not everyone does medical transitioning and not everyone wants to have surgery. And it's expensive and it's surgery. It's a big decision. So not everyone who is trans decides to have any kind of medical transitioning. And then there's the legal transitioning. So folks can change the name on their driver's license. They can change their birth certificate. They can change their transcripts for college, etc., so that the name that they present to the world matches who they know themselves to be. Really important. If I'm teaching a class, I have had students email me prior and say, this is the name you're going to see on the transcript. This is the name I go by, which is wonderful because then I can call out their real name and not the name that's on the transcript if they haven't legally changed any of that, because the university or wherever is legally required to have the legal name on all those transcripts. Right? So the ability to do this, changing your name and changing your markers, can very often help with that whole social transitioning as well. All right, so let's stop there. That was a lot. Let's stop there and see what kind of questions y'all have.
Really great. Well, and thank you so much, Dr. Turner. We've had a few questions come in, and I think one of the ones, maybe we'll combine two questions, and it's to get more clarity on the umbrella of transgender and then some of the other terminology. So you had a list of different identifiers like gender nonconforming, gender queer, non-binary. We even had someone ask about what does non-binary mean? So could you speak more to sort of the list of identifiers and how they connect to the umbrella of transgender?
Sure. So just non-binary means that the person does not identify on the binary, male and female, right? There's two ends of this spectrum, man and woman. And the person who identifies as non-binary is saying, I don't fit cleanly and clearly into either of those categories, right? I'm somewhere, I'm not that, right? Not man or woman, non-binary. The thing about labels is there's new ones all the time because they're personal, right? Labels are personal. What I choose to call myself is one of the things that helps me feel like I have some identity that's mine. Right? So some people who have the exact same gender expression might identify themselves with a label that's different. So the list of things that I put up there is just a sum of the language that people use to describe how they know themselves to be. That's not necessarily using trans man or trans woman. You hear how binary trans man and trans women is, right? So gender non-conforming doesn't feel that man woman kind of tension. There's another way of identifying that doesn't fall clearly in those two binary.
Yeah, one of the terms that I kind of like as well is gender fluid. And so it kind of speaks to that fluidity, you know, it starts to get folks to think about these concepts in different spatial orientations as
Absolutely.
well, one of the questions that came in that I think was carried over from the intersex conversation earlier was around sex assigned at birth and whether or not there are examples either in the United States or maybe elsewhere around the world where they don't assign a sex at birth. That doesn't get added to your, birth certificate. Do you have any thoughts about where that might be occurring, or if we're still really set on assigning sex at birth?
Yes, there are some countries now who are, what's the word I'm looking for? Allowing for X to be on a child's marker, right? So it's MFX. And that is a way to not have to put nothing down, but to say that we acknowledge that not everyone falls in these clear categories, both with their sex or their gender, and that X is now becoming, in some parts of the world, a legitimate marker on a birth certificate. So that's been really helpful.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. We've got a lot of really great questions coming in. I think we'll take one more and then, just conscious of time, turn it back over to you.
Okay.
So I think this relates to some of the material in the previous, most recent slides around different forms of gender expression. And so there was a question about if you could explain the term drag and how it might relate to gender expression.
Okay, so drag is fully about gender expression, right? So if typically, not always, but typically folks who are in the drag community are typically male assigned at birth, typically identify as bisexual or gay, but for performance or for relaxation, will dress in stereotypically female attire, sometimes exaggerated female attire, to perform or to just relax, right? And the term drag started as a performance term. Very often, people who are in the drag community use the pronouns of she when they're in drag, when they are dressed as a female woman, but will use male pronouns when they are not expressing a female or feminine expression. Drag also can be used for when people, for example, I never wore skirts for a really long time, didn't wear dresses, didn't wear skirts. I just like pants. I just don't like dresses, right? And so one day I wore a skirt and I felt like, okay, I'm in drag today, right? I'm just doing something that's a little, right, different than what I usually do. And this is what I feel like expressing today. So drag is typically a performance term, but it can also be a term for people who dress in clothing their gender expression, that's not their sex of assignment, but they don't identify as transgender.
Well, thank you very much for that clarity. That was a great exploration of the definition and meaning of the term. I think we'll transition back to your slides because there are a few questions coming in about how do you deal with folks who don't understand or maybe are not willing to understand. What are some of the tools we can use to be better allies? I think that speaks to where you're moving next in your presentation.
Absolutely. Let's do one more of these things. Let's talk about the difference between orientation and identity, because this is what people really confuse all the time. So let's talk about the difference. Okay. When we talk about sexual orientation, we're talking about who you're attracted to, right? As opposed to your gender identity, which is who you are, right? So gender identity, who I know I am; sexual orientation, who I'm attracted to. And we have no idea how our sexual orientation develops either, right? There's lots of folks trying to figure this out for whatever reason, I don't know. But they're trying to figure out how our sexual orientation develops. And we don't really know that, but people know who they are attracted to. Right? So a couple things to remember when we talk about your erotic attraction, that is not dependent on your gender, right? And this is where it gets confusing. We're going to come back to this in a minute, but it's not dependent on your gender. In other words, if I am female, my orientation, my erotic or affectual orientation, has nothing to do with the fact that I am female. It's just who I'm attracted to. Okay? The label that gets put on that has to do with my sex or my gender, but the orientation itself is not dependent on that. It's not determined by gender, and gender is not determined by sexual orientation. So when we talk about sexual orientation, there's a couple pieces that are important to remember. Number one, the orientation, who I am turned on by, right? Who I'm erotically attracted to is one aspect of my sexual orientation. How I act on that orientation is a whole nother thing, right? That's my behavior. So my behavior can be very different from my orientation, right? And my identity, in other words, how I label myself, what do I call myself, that can also be very different from my behavior and my orientation. I'm sure y'all have heard that some folks will be asked, how do you know you're lesbian if you've never been with a man, right? Because it has nothing to do with my behavior, right? You know who you're attracted to. You may not have sex with any of them, but you know who you're attracted to, right? So these are three different things. And your identity is something that's personal. Like we said with transgender labels, right? What I call myself is personal and not necessarily connected to my behavior or my orientation, actually, right? So let's look at some of this, right? First of all, before we look at some of the labels, I just wanted to mention the Kinsey scale. And Kinsey was a doctor and researcher back in the late 1940s who interviewed thousands of people and published 2 sexuality tombs. And one of the things that the Kinsey group recognized was that when they asked people about their sexual fantasies and behaviors and all of their orientation questions, that they made a scale from 0 to 6, right? So some people were 0, exclusively straight. And some people were on this continuum, a 6, like exclusively gay or lesbian. In the middle, there's some flexibility, right? So I might identify as straight, but I might have some fantasies or incidental relationships with same-sex partners, right? And what the Kinsey group found was that only about 10% of the population is a 0 or a 6. That's it. that most people fell around 1 or 2. So most people have incidental or more than incidental homosexual fantasies, wishes, behaviors, experiences, desires, etc. And that curve goes up around 1 or 2 and then comes back down to around 6. So when we talk about sexual orientation, we tend to talk again in binary, gay or straight. And that's actually not how the world works. People are not either gay or straight for the most part, right? 10%. But most of us fall somewhere in the middle, which is also something that we are rarely taught. Okay? So because of that, right, that fluidity and that range of orientation, labels become very personal. So here's just some of them. This is just a few, right? So here's where the terms that we've been talking about connect, right? Follow me here. These are orientations, right? Who I am erotically or affectually attracted to. So let's just typically, right? Gay, if I'm male and I'm attracted to men, straight, men and women, lesbian, women attracted to women. Bisexual is a term that very often people get confused with, like, is it just the person doesn't know yet or hasn't chosen or is kind of on the fence? And actually that's not what bisexual means. If someone identifies as bisexual, typically it means they're attracted to both men and women. Now, it doesn't mean they're attracted to absolutely everyone on the planet, right? Because everyone has what we call an attraction template. An attraction template meaning this is the type of person I'm attracted to, right? So I might be attracted to tall, dark, funny, intelligent, athletic people, right? Or short, funny, right? Like you have your list, right, of what you're attracted to. And everyone has like, oh, that person's hot, that person's not, right? We all have that. For most folks, majority of folks, the sex of the person is on the top of the list. So I'm attracted to men who are tall and dark and funny and educated, etc., or women who are tall and dark, right? I have an attraction template, and for most folks, the male or female part is on the list. For folks who are bisexual, that's just not on their list. The sex of the person is not on their attraction template. So it doesn't mean they're just attracted to everybody and everything. It means that that marker, right, that sex of the person is not on their attraction template. Let's jump over to pansexual. Pansexual typically means that the person is also oriented or attracted to folks who are intersex or trans or on that non-binary spectrum, not just people who are male or female cisgender folks. Asexual, LGBTQIA, there's the A, are folks who just have no sexual attraction. Right? They've just not been erotically attracted to people. Doesn't mean they don't have romantic relationships, doesn't mean they don't have loving, affectionate, companionate relationships. It just means they just have never experienced and don't experience any erotic attraction. So they're asexual. Queer is a term that used to be used, as I'm sure all of you know, as a derogatory term that's kind of been re-owned by folks in these communities. And queer is a very personal term. Some people will mean it to mean that they're just not straight cis. That's all that means. And some other folks may have a really clear definition for themselves about what they mean when they identify as queer. Heteroflexible is just a term I like. I just like the word. No, it's heteroflexible is very often a term that straight folks will use because remember I said we typically fall in that 1 or 2 category on the Kinsey scale, that every once in a while I'll have a sexual attraction or a sexual experience with someone of the same sex or gender, but typically I identify as straight. There's lots of other labels, lots and lots, because it's a very personal term. And someone's label is often connected to the sex of the person. This is where this connection piece comes in, right? It's all, if you look at all those terms, they're all very body related, right? People with this body relating to people of this body, right? Even though the sex of a person has nothing to do with their orientation, the language that we use for orientation is based on bodies, right? Which gets confusing. Because, for example, say I've always considered myself to be female, and I marry a man, and then I begin to recognize that actually I'm a man. I'm not a woman, and I transition. Now, prior to transitioning, I might have labeled myself as straight because I'm in love with this man. Now that I've transitioned and I'm now a trans man, I might label myself gay. I might label myself as bisexual. I might label myself as straight, right? It's all incredibly personal. And what someone decides fits for them is what fits for them, right? So there's no like umbrella of everyone who falls in this category believes or thinks or recognizes the exact same thing, right? Labels are very personal, very, very personal. All right, let's stop. We have more questions.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Dr. Turner. And we did have a question come in that, for the definitions that you've provided today, can you speak to maybe the plethora of other definitions there might be out there in the world for these terms? How do people navigate that? It came up in the context of bisexual and pansexual, saying an attendee said that they had heard different definitions than the ones that you presented.
Yeah, and very often you just need to ask the person. If someone comes out to you and says, this is how I identify, if they are trusting you with that expression, it's very common to just say, tell me what you mean by that. What does that mean to you? Right? Because folks will use terms interchangeably. Their labels will change over time, depending on all kinds of things. So asking people what they mean, because there's many, many new terms. If you look up new terms for sexual orientation or even new terms for transgender, you'll come up with all kinds of stuff, things we no longer use, new terms that I've never heard of before. It's a constantly changing thing. So asking people who come out to you what they mean by that, if they've trusted you enough with that, I'm confident that when you say, tell me what you mean by that, it's perfectly acceptable.
Wonderful. Yeah, we talk about that a lot in the context of cultural and linguistic competency around having cultural humility, having the humility enough to say, hey, I don't know this. I don't know what this means. Can you help me learn more? In that sort of beauty of that conversation.
Much better than cultural competence, right?
Yeah. We're hopeful that language will change as well in the future. So we had a question in relation to what you just presented on around sexual orientation. If you could speak to the differences between romantic attraction and sexual attraction.
Sure. One is sexual attraction has to do with your desire to have a sexual relationship with someone. For example, okay, let me put it this way. This might be easier. I can be sexually attracted to, say I'm sexually attracted to men, but I can also be sexually attracted to women. Right? So I have a bisexual orientation. However, do I want to marry, have a relationship, have a committed romantic partnership with both men and women? Maybe not. Maybe I only feel like I could have a life with a woman, but I could also be sexually attracted to men. Right? So A romantic attraction has to do with partnering and that loving, committed, companionate kind of relationship. And sex has to do with who I'm sexually attracted to.
Wonderful. Thank you for that answer. And I think we've got some other questions we can leave for the longer Q&A, and we'll turn it back to you for the next section.
All right. So let's talk some toolbox, like that question of, so what do I do with all this, right? First of all, the name of the presentation, right? Don't assume that you know who's in the room. When folks identify in these categories, right? Intersex, transgender, LGBT, you don't know by looking at someone if they are any of these, right? So what happens is people assume the default is cis and straight. So for example, if I'm in a room full of people and I am a person of color, folks who might tell a racist joke and see me in the room may not tell that joke because they see who's in the room and they kind of mute themselves. However, you don't see this. So folks who identify as LGBTQI will very often hear horrible, horrible things and jokes and comments and all kinds of stuff because people assume they are not in the room. And so one of the major pieces that you can do as an ally is to not assume and to keep that in your head when all the language that you use, whenever you discuss anything, to make sure you understand that you do not know who's in the room and just assume that these folks are, right? If you just, as a blanket way to walk through the world, assume that folks who fall into any of these communities are in the room, that's a really important piece to remember. If you are working in a mental health field, or if you have a family member who has mental health issues, it does not necessarily mean that those mental health issues are due to their being LGBTQ. Very often I'll find that clinicians will be like, well, they are transgender. I'm like, so what, right? Because people still can have hereditary depression or anxiety or whatever it is they walk with that has nothing to do with the fact that they are trans or intersexed or whatever. However, it is very common for someone who is transgender, LGBT, whatever, to have anxiety and depression, and because it's hard, right? The stigma of walking through the world, if you are not out or if you are out, right? Walking through the world is hard when you don't identify as cis or straight. So you don't assume that these two things are connected, but recognize that it's harder, right? And they may be. Let's see, yes, names. Don't ask the person what their real name is. The name they give you is their real name. Use that name, just like you would if someone was giving you a nickname. Whether you approve of it or not is not important. The name the person gives you is the name that they have. It's very, very, it's violence against that person to use the name that you think they should use because you don't agree with who they are. Right? So use the name the person gives you. If someone comes out to you, make sure that you ask them, who else knows about this? Right? Don't assume that if someone comes out to you, that they've come out to everybody. You may be a safe person for them. Right? So I have friends who are out in their social life, but not at work. Right? So don't assume that everybody knows this, or bring it up as something that's like an interesting tidbit of information about this person, right? Be careful if someone has entrusted you with their identity that you do not out them to other people. Be careful about making assumptions, right, about people's sexual orientation, given their transgender status or any status, right? That remember that sexual orientation is not connected to or dependent on anyone's gender. Right? And know that there is no way to be LGBTQ, right? There's no particular way to have sex. There's no particular way to dress. There's no way to do that, right? So just like if you identify as straight, you have no idea what other straight people are doing in the bedroom, and you probably don't want to know, right? So making assumptions about, oh, I guess this is the kind of sex you have, not necessarily true, right? We talked about this a little bit, that LGBTQ plus folks have a much higher likelihood of trauma and spiritual abuse and bullying. And so it's really important to recognize that if you are cis and straight, your world is much safer, even if you are in a non-safe area or in a non-safe family, your world is still safer. I don't know why I have to put this last one down, but I do. Just don't ask people about their genitals, like blanket statement, right? In general, don't ask people about their genitals. I always have to put that up there because so many folks, have you had bottom surgery? Right? It's like, why do you need to know that? Not important with your straight friends, not important with your cis friends, not important with your friends, not important, right? There's no right or wrong way. It's like they're not doing it right. And there's no gay lifestyle. There's no straight lifestyle. This lifestyle word, it has nothing to do with how people identify in the categories that we are talking about. Also, microaggressions is a term that we usually talk about in relationship to racial aggression, which is kind of ways that people think that they are being nice and they're actually harming someone. It's little tiny violent things to say, right? And so here's just some example of that, right? You'd pass better if you did this or that. Have you ever thought about doing this? I would never know, you look so normal, right? Those kinds of little microaggressions. So avoid any of those kinds of backhanded compliments. This is the genderbread person. There's also a gender unicorn. You can look it up online as just a way to kind of visualize what we've been talking about. This continuum is kind of misleading. In other words, the way this looks like is that the binary are on the ends and everything we've been talking about is kind of in the middle. And really it's not in the middle. It's not like if you have white people and black people, the middle is not Asian, right? It's something else, right? Something else. And so when we talk about that, this is a way to think about these concepts, but it's really not the in the middle as this looks here. I just wanted to kind of articulate that. But as a way to just review, your gender expression, right, is what you present to the world. Your identity is who you know yourself to be. Your orientation is who you're sexually attracted to. And your gender identity, your sexual identity or your sex is your biology. Good. All right. So let's finish up. How much time do we have? 10 minutes?
About 10 minutes. Is that correct, Nancy? Okay, we got some head nods. So yeah, about 10 minutes. We've got some questions that have come into the Q&A that we can tackle. And if folks have more questions, then please feel free to add them to the Q&A feature. So one question that came in, actually a few, were around preferred pronouns and how to be respectful of preferred pronouns, and some queries around the distinction of when to use or how best to understand the use of them, they, and theirs.
So if you are unsure about what pronouns someone uses, you can use they, right? So I'm old, right? They is plural, but not anymore. So I have really trained myself to use they all the time. So use the person's name or use they until the person might say to you what they use. Right? Pronouns are also very personal. Right? So people will tell you what pronouns they use. I will often just, if I have to wear a name tag, I'll put my pronouns down, not because my gender expression is kind of ambiguous, but because it says, I get it. right? That people have pronouns that are not always what everyone can immediately identify. And so it opens people up to share theirs or to ask. But you can always ask people. For example, I have a friend who I've always known as female and did not see them for a couple years, and saw them at a conference and realized that they were, their gender expression was much more male, and people were using male pronouns. So I just went up to my friend and said, hey, I noticed people are using male pronouns for you. Is that what you're preferring now? Is that what you're using? And they said, yeah, great. Right? So asking if you're comfortable doing that, using they will, or the person's name, right? It takes some doing. You have to pay attention, but it's the least you can do.
Thank you for that answer, Dr. Turner. That was great. We had a question, actually a few related questions come in to your earlier notes and points around names and ensuring that folks are able to use their affirmed name, excuse me, as opposed to potentially the name that was assigned at birth. And so the question was actually specifically around the legal component that you mentioned, of sort of that legal transition and how that can be very difficult depending on where you live in the United States or elsewhere in the world. So in the context of the US, maybe Pennsylvania, if we can focus it in there, if you know, do you know what the legislative mandate is for what things have to be the name as presented on the birth certificate, or are there things that can be in the student's affirmed name? They specifically reference things around report cards, classroom rosters, diplomas, transcripts, yearbooks. They really want to support their students through their GSA, Gay Straight Alliance, for those that don't know, but aren't really sure how to advocate in the best possible form.
So you're saying if the person has not legally changed their name, but correct?
Correct. Sorry if the audio went out there.
Yeah. I am not sure at the moment what the legal requirements are. However, I know that there is multiple high schools, middle schools, universities, etc., workplaces that will put the person's chosen name into their system and just do it. Just do it. Right? Some places are not comfortable doing that. It also has to do if someone, for example, has scholarship money and everything needs to be similar, right? So that's something I would recommend, that if someone is in that situation where they've not legally changed their name, which is hard to do, right? It takes some time. But they meet with whoever it is that holds that information, and people, institutions can separate what they do behind the scenes legally with, for example, insurance and all of those kinds of things, and what they do publicly, rosters, those kinds of things. I've had students who've had their chosen name put on their diploma, right? Because that's the name they're going to use for the rest of their life. They want their diploma to match their life. So legally, I think there's two kind of areas. One is official stuff, like with scholarships, insurance, etc., and one with just public kind of forward presenting things.
Great, thank you for that answer. And there's a related sort of question comment that I think is good for folks to be aware of. What are your thoughts on the terminology of preferred pronouns or preferred names? Should we just get away from saying preferred and just say, hey, what are your pronouns? What's your name?
Absolutely. I think so. However, I'm not a part of that community. And I think what people have been feeling is that preferred pronouns sounds like a choice of who you are. I would prefer to be called, right? Now, if I have like, for example, my nickname is Landi. I prefer Landi, right? But that's really different than me knowing who I am and wanting the world to acknowledge that. That's my name. It's important to me. I'm fine with either name, right? But as far as being respectful for people who know better who they are than you do, to use their pronoun as opposed to preferred pronoun. right? Because preferred says, I would prefer you use this, but you're welcome not to.
Yeah,
And that's really not what we're talking about.
exactly. Well, thank you for sharing that. And thanks to the attendee who entered into the conversation to raise that point. I think this is really interesting, this next question comment, because it also, I think, is a very Pennsylvania thing, which is they say, I grew up calling everyone Mr., Mrs., Miss Sam, how are you doing today? That type of thing is very Pennsylvanian. And I should know better now being a lesbian, but it's something that I don't even think about. Is there a way to break myself of this and still be respectful?
Yeah. Use the term if you have the option. For example, as a professor, people don't have to say Ms. Turner. They say Professor Turner or Dr. Turner or whatever else is on there. It's very often, it's like any other habit that you just have to be more aware of and stop doing, right? So it does sound like it's a term of respect, but it's not if you're doing it incorrectly and it hurts the person and they have to correct you. So asking that person, what would you prefer I call you? What would you like me to call you? This is my upbringing and it's making me uncomfortable. What would be helpful for me to call you?
Again, having those courageous and humble
conversations. Yes, ask.
Well, we had talked earlier about sex assigned at birth and new innovations and being able to mark X instead of M and F. And there was a attendee who noted that that's happening right now for New York driver's licenses, but that it's complicated because although at the state level that may be happening, the federal level still requires M and F. So are you noticing any potential changes or advocacy for federal level additions of X?
Yes, now in the last year. Yes, but it's slow to come. It's like any other political or change in the culture. It just takes forever. Hopefully that is, and it is the direction that we're moving in, but it just is, it's taking unbearably long for mostly logistical and political reasons, not because it's that complicated.
Yeah. That tends to be how the most sticky things seem to arise and move forward. But what did former congressman say? It's good to get into some good trouble every now and then. So, well, I think we have time for one question as we close out. And that question, we've had a lot come in, so it's kind of a combined question that speaks to the heart of our PA Care Partnership grant, where we are really focusing on youth and children birth to 21. Are there different approaches that we should be taking for our LGBTQ community at different ages? So there's been a lot of questions that came in saying, at what age should we be affirming gender identity? At what age should we be thinking about medical transitioning? And so there was a lot of questions about age and the way in which children affirm themselves within the LGBTQ community. And I'm curious if you have any closing thoughts on how we address the sort of generational aspects of this conversation.
Yeah, and that is a huge conversation that many people are talking about. Affirming a child's gender expression is something that is reversible, because when we're talking about children, we're just talking about gender expression. We're just talking about the clothes that they wear. Right? And so, and that, the hair that they have and those kinds of things. So if community, parent, family, whatever, sets up support and education around the fact that this child is coming to school dressed this way, right? And there's support around that, there is nothing wrong with that, right? Because if the child continues to identify in that way, then off you go. If they don't, then it's just clothes and hair and those kinds of things. Where it gets difficult is around puberty, because with transitions, especially hormonal, etc., you can stop something from happening, but you can't reverse something that's already happened, right? So if I have male pattern baldness and I do estrogen blockers and increase my estrogen, my hair is not going to grow back, right? But if I have those hormonal blockers and additions, I can then prevent that from happening, right? So it's those ages that are mostly where the focus is about, oh my gosh, how do we do this? And kids know who they are, right? But the rule at the moment is that you do things that are reversible and wait until this person is clear or of age to make those kinds of, right? Because our brains are not developed at that age to do long-term consequence thinking. But if this child is so anxious or depressed or suicidal or whatever, there is no harm in having this child do some reversible medical or social transitioning to just help them feel like themselves, right? And then later on, as an adult, we decide what we want to do.
Well, thank you so much for everything you shared today, for that insight in response to that question. I know I've personally been inspired by the story of Jazz Jennings, following, their life story. And I think for others that may be looking to further explore the generational aspects, Jazz is such a wonderful representative for the community. So thank you, Dr. Turner, and I'll turn it back over to our team.
Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you, Dr. Turner. This was a very informational presentation. I think I've taken away a lot of different gems that I can use moving forward in my life and in the everyday kind of way. So thank you so much for such a great presentation. Information about continuing education credits and certificate of attendance are in the email you received today in the chat. I also believe that Mark has been placing some PDFs and links as far as continuing education credits are concerned into the chat. So you can find those things there. Our next presentation is It's a Journey, Not a Destination, Culture and Linguistic Competence Program Showcase, and that will be on Thursday, July 8th, 2021 from 2:30 to 4 p.m. We look forward to having you join us then. And until then, everyone take care.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. And I'd like to add from one of the comments in the chat that we felt that your talk was affirming. And thank you so much for that and for being here today.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you and have a great day.